My name's Henry. I'm 32, and Thanksgiving dinners at my family's house have always felt more like battlegrounds than celebrations. Some families laugh, share stories, and pass around turkey like they're passing around love. Mine? Every passing dish came with a side of judgment, criticism, or a cutting remark. Growing up, I learned to brace myself before walking into the dining room, as though I were about to sit through an interrogation rather than a holiday meal. My dad was the worst. To him, success wasn't just measured in money. It was measured in whether you lived life his way. He built a company from scratch when I was young, and while that should have been inspiring, it turned into a weapon. He wore his achievements like armor, and anyone who didn't follow his exact blueprint was treated as a disappointment. I never doubted his work ethic, but I always doubted his ability to see people for who they were rather than what they could accomplish for him. That was the environment I grew up in. I was the middle child, sandwiched between my older brother, Daniel, who idolized Dad and joined the family company, and my younger sister, Clara, who managed to keep herself out of the line of fire by playing the role of the golden child. Daniel was the heir apparent, the responsible one, the one Dad was grooming to take over. Clara? She got away with anything simply by batting her eyes and smiling. And me? Well, I was the dreamer. The one Dad said had no backbone. The one who went off to college and studied something he considered useless, instead of taking a desk at his firm the moment I graduated high school. I'd learned early on that no matter how much effort I put in, it would never be enough to earn his approval. So eventually, I stopped trying to earn it. When Thanksgiving rolled around that year, I already knew what I was walking into. I had been doing well for myself, better than anyone in my family suspected, but I hadn't exactly broadcasted it. I worked in a sector Dad had always scoffed at, technology. He dismissed startups and digital companies as flashes in the pan, destined to crumble, unlike his real business, with brick and mortar, contracts, and employees in pressed suits. He loved reminding me of that every chance he got. So, when I told him years earlier that I had founded a company with a few partners, he rolled his eyes and said, "Call me when you get a real job." I stopped updating him after that. It wasn't worth the ridicule. Walking into the dining room that Thanksgiving, I noticed immediately how much had changed in the house, but how little had changed in the people. My parents' table was still long enough to seat a dozen, polished to a shine that reflected the chandelier above it. The good china was laid out, just like every year, as though presentation could cover up the tension that inevitably filled the air. Daniel was already seated next to Dad, laughing too loudly at some half-hearted joke, clearly angling to show his loyalty. Clara sat near Mom, scrolling her phone, offering the occasional nod when Mom leaned in to whisper something. And then there was Dad at the head of the table, carving knife resting near his plate like a general's sword. Dinner started the way it always did. Small talk, strained laughter, polite comments that felt like filler before the inevitable storm. Mom asked me if I was still messing around with that computer stuff, and Dad gave a snort, as if the mere mention of it confirmed my inadequacy. "At least Daniel's doing something useful," he said, nodding toward my brother. Daniel, ever eager to please, puffed up with pride. "We just closed another big contract last week," he announced. "Dad and I have been working nonstop, but it's paying off. The company's growing." He looked at me as he said it, the implication hanging thick in the air. "What have you done lately, Henry?" I tried to keep my face neutral. I had learned over the years to swallow my retorts, to sit quietly and let the barbs land without visible damage. But that night, something in me was simmering. Maybe it was the years of pent-up frustration. Maybe it was because, for once, I knew something they didn't. But I stayed silent, letting the conversation flow around me, waiting for Dad to deliver the inevitable blow. It came just as Mom passed him the gravy boat. He chuckled, not even looking at me directly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You'll never amount to anything, Henry. Not with the way you drift around chasing nonsense." His words landed in the room like a dropped glass. The laughter died, forks paused halfway to mouths, and even Clara put her phone down. It wasn't just the insult, it was the casual cruelty, the way he dismissed me in front of everyone as though I were nothing more than a failed experiment. I felt heat rising in my chest, my pulse pounding in my ears. I don't know what made me stand up in that moment, but I did. My chair scraped loudly against the polished hardwood, echoing through the silent room. All eyes turned to me, Mom's wide with caution, Daniel's narrowed with curiosity, Clara's raised in mild amusement. And Dad just smirked, like he'd finally drawn me out into the open. "What's the matter, son?" he asked, feigning innocence. "Don't like a little honesty?" I stared at him, my hands trembling, not from fear but from the sheer weight of holding myself back for so many years. The words burned on the tip of my tongue, but I swallowed them, for the moment. Because what I wanted to say wasn't something to waste in the heat of the moment. It was bigger than that. Much bigger. But I let him see just enough of a smile to confuse him. I leaned forward slightly and said, "You know what, Dad? Maybe tonight's not the night for honesty. But soon, you'll understand exactly how wrong you've been about me." The smirk faltered, just for a second. And in that silence, with everyone frozen around the table, I sat back down, heart racing, knowing that this time, the storm wasn't going to pass quietly. And that was the moment I realized this Thanksgiving wasn't going to end like all the others. The silence after my words hung in the air longer than I expected, but eventually Dad cleared his throat, muttered something about overcooked turkey, and the evening resumed like nothing had happened. Except it wasn't nothing. I could feel the shift, Daniel stealing glances at me, Clara smirking like she knew I was bluffing, Mom trying to smooth everything over by talking about the pumpkin pie waiting in the kitchen. But Dad's eyes lingered, sharp and probing, as though he were trying to decide if I was worth the energy of tearing down further. I'd spent years trying to avoid that gaze, but this time, I met it. I didn't look away. Dinner went on, and with each course, the subtle digs piled up. Daniel recounted stories of deals closed and contracts signed, always slipping in reminders that he and Dad were the backbone of the family. "If it weren't for us," he said at one point, lifting his glass of wine, "there wouldn't even be a Thanksgiving this year. Not with the way costs have gone up." He looked at me when he said it, his smile full of practiced arrogance. Dad chuckled and added, "Some people around here should be grateful their siblings and parents know how to work hard. Otherwise, they'd be, what's the phrase, out on the street." My fork scraped against the plate a little louder than necessary as I cut through the ham. I forced myself to smile politely, though my jaw was tight enough to ache. Clara, who usually stayed out of these jabs, leaned in just then with a sly grin. "Don't be too harsh on him, Dad. Henry's just sensitive. That's why he never wanted to work with you. Couldn't handle the pressure, right?" The table erupted into laughter. Not cruel, roaring laughter, but the kind of low, condescending chuckles that sting worse. I swallowed hard, each laugh cutting deeper than the last. I tried to remind myself that it didn't matter anymore, that soon, all of this would turn on its head. But in that moment, it was impossible not to feel 12 years old again, sitting at the same table, listening to the same jokes at my expense. Mom tried to intervene, her tone half-hearted. "Let's not ruin dinner. It's the holidays, after all." But she didn't mean it. She never did. Mom had always been the great peacemaker, which really just meant she smoothed over Dad's cruelty without ever confronting it. Keeping up appearances was her specialty. The kind of woman who would smile for a photograph even if the house was on fire behind her. Daniel leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. "You know, Henry, there's still time. Dad could find a spot for you at the company. Probably not anything important, of course, but maybe something in the back office. Paperwork. Filing. You always were decent with computers, weren't you?" He smirked, waiting for the reaction he wanted. Dad nodded sagely, as if Daniel had just offered me salvation. "Yes, something small. Better than nothing. That way you're not wandering around wasting your time. Think of it as us doing you a favor." I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging crescents into my palms. For years, I had trained myself to endure moments like this, to tell myself it wasn't worth the fight. But this time, their words only fueled me. Every smug look, every belittling comment, every reminder of the hierarchy they'd created, it was all building towards something. They thought they were cutting me down. What they didn't know was that they were sharpening me. Clara piped up again, tilting her head innocently. "Although, Henry, maybe you should think carefully before working with Dad. You wouldn't want to embarrass him in front of the clients. Remember when you—" She launched into an old story, one I hadn't thought about in years, of a presentation I gave back in high school that flopped. She exaggerated every detail, turning it into a comedy routine for the table. Daniel laughed so hard he nearly spilled his wine. Dad shook his head, saying, "Some things never change." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. but I forced myself to stay calm. I let them finish their story, let the laughter run its course, and when the noise finally died down, I set my fork neatly on my plate. "You're right," I said quietly, smiling in a way that made Daniel squint at me suspiciously. "Some things don't change." The words hung in the air, deceptively simple, and I could see the uncertainty flicker in Dad's eyes. He didn't like when I didn't play my part, the quiet scapegoat, the punching bag. And for the first time in years, I could feel the balance of power shifting, even if no one else recognized it yet. Dinner stretched on, the tension thickening with every passing minute. Dad tried to reassert control by bragging about his company's dominance in the market. Daniel chimed in with every detail he could add, and Clara continued her little digs. But I sat there calmly, almost detached, watching them play their roles like actors in a play they didn't realize was nearing its final act. I looked at the chandelier above the table, its crystals reflecting the warm light, and thought about how fragile it was. One wrong move, and it would all come crashing down, shattering into pieces that could never be put back together. That was the moment I knew their laughter wouldn't last much longer. Dessert was always Mom's attempt to wash away the bitterness of dinner. She bustled into the kitchen, reappearing with pumpkin and pecan pies, smiling as if sugar and cinnamon could make us forget the venom that had already been served. Normally, I'd keep my head down, quietly accept my slice, and let the evening drift toward its predictable end. But that year, the undercurrent of hostility hadn't faded, it had deepened. Every word, every laugh at my expense had sunk its claws deeper into me, and I could feel something coiling inside, waiting. As plates of pie were passed around, Dad cleared his throat and tapped his fork against his glass. The room fell quiet, and I knew instantly what was coming. He loved his little speeches. He treated every family gathering like a company shareholders meeting, where he was the commanding CEO and the rest of us were employees waiting for scraps of approval. "I just want to take a moment," he began, puffing out his chest, "to say how proud I am of this family." His eyes drifted toward Daniel, who straightened in his seat like he'd just received a medal. "Some of us have really stepped up, put in the work, made something of themselves. Daniel especially. Your contributions have been invaluable. You've shown responsibility, loyalty, and the kind of work ethic that keeps this family strong." Daniel beamed, lifting his glass in mock modesty. "Just following your example, Dad." "And Clara," Dad continued, turning toward her, "always dependable, always making us proud with how you present yourself. Graceful, polished. You're the heart of this family." Clara smiled sweetly, soaking it in, her phone forgotten for the moment. Then his eyes landed on me. He didn't smile. He didn't soften. Instead, he sighed, shaking his head like he was about to deliver bad news. "And then there's Henry." He let the pause drag long enough for the sting to set in. "I wish I could say I was proud of you, son. But pride comes from results. And results, well, you can't just live off dreams forever. At some point, reality has to set in." The fork in my hand clattered against the plate before I could stop it. The whole table froze. Even Mom looked uneasy, though she didn't interrupt. Dad leaned back, satisfied with his truth, sipping his wine like a man who'd just finished passing judgment from a throne. That should have been the low point. But it wasn't. The betrayal came a moment later. Daniel leaned forward, clearing his throat with exaggerated seriousness. "Actually, Dad, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. And I guess now's as good a time as any." His eyes flicked to me, sharp and calculating, before locking back on Dad. "I ran into a few people recently, old friends of Henry's. They mentioned he's been trying to start some little company. Tech stuff. Apparently, it hasn't been going well. Investors backing out, clients bailing. Sounds like he's in over his head." I froze. My pulse spiked. Those were half-truths twisted into daggers. Yes, years ago my first venture had stumbled, like most startups do. But that wasn't my present. Not anymore. Still, Daniel spun the story with the ease of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. Dad's smirk deepened. "Is that so?" Daniel nodded gravely. "I didn't want to say anything, but I thought you should know. Maybe that's why he never talks about it. Because there's nothing to talk about." Clara chimed in, laughing softly. "Oh, that makes sense. I always wondered why you avoided questions about work, Henry. Guess the dream wasn't big enough to survive, huh?" The room tilted. Betrayal has a unique weight. It's not just the lie itself, but the intent behind it. Daniel knew enough of my past to twist the knife perfectly, to paint me as the failure Dad always claimed I was. And he did it not out of concern, but for the cruel satisfaction of cementing his position as the golden son. Dad shook his head slowly, his voice dripping with condescension. Henry, Henry, Henry. I tried to warn you. I told you these flights of fancy would get you nowhere. Now look where you are, sitting at my table, eating my food, while your brother carries the family legacy on his back. I could feel my hands trembling beneath the table, not from weakness, but from rage. I looked at Daniel, smug, leaning back in his chair as if he'd just saved the company from a crisis, and I realized something. This wasn't just about Dad's cruelty anymore. This was about Daniel deliberately painting me as a failure, erasing years of work, all to make himself look better. Mom tried to cut the tension with a brittle laugh. Come now, let's not ruin dessert. But no one listened. Dad was locked onto me. Daniel basked in the glow of betrayal, and Clara smirked like it was all entertainment. I swallowed hard, my voice low but steady. Funny thing about stories, Daniel, I said, meeting his eyes. They're only powerful if they're true. His smirk faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly, waving me off. Sure, Henry. Keep telling yourself that. I leaned back, forcing a calm I didn't feel. My heart was hammering, my thoughts racing, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. The game had just changed. They thought they'd cornered me, exposed me, humiliated me once and for all. But they didn't realize that the betrayal wasn't an ending. It was the turning point. And for the first time all evening, I wasn't just enduring the storm. I was preparing to unleash one. After Daniel's little performance, dessert turned into a blur. I don't even remember tasting the pie. Every laugh, every side glance, every smug smile weighed on me like chains. Dad was practically glowing with vindication, nodding along to Daniel's concerns, as though his golden son had done him some great service. Clara kept snickering into her napkin, whispering little comments under her breath that were just loud enough for me to hear. And Mom, she just stared at her plate, lips pressed tight, refusing to meet my eyes. I wanted to stand up, to slam my hands down on the table, to shout the truth so loud the chandelier rattled. But I didn't, because I realized something dangerous in that moment. No matter what I said, they wouldn't believe me. They didn't want to believe me. The version of me they had built, the failure, the dreamer, the disappointment, fit too neatly into the story they told themselves. And if I tried to break it now, with only my word as proof, it would fall on deaf ears. So instead, I sat there. I let them have their victory. I forced myself to chew, to smile faintly, to act as though I hadn't just been gutted in front of my family. My silence wasn't surrender. It was strategy, but that didn't make it easier. After dinner, Daniel and Dad retreated to the study with their cigars, their voices carrying through the walls, full of laughter and clinking glasses. Clara went upstairs with Mom, likely to help clean up while really gossiping about how pitiful I was. I stayed in the dining room, staring at the empty plates, the half-drunk glasses of wine, the crumbs scattered like debris from a battlefield. My hands shook as I stacked the dishes, not from weakness, but from the sheer pressure of keeping myself contained. I slipped outside afterward, into the cold November air. The night was crisp, stars hidden behind heavy clouds, the kind of air that makes your lungs ache when you breathe too deeply. I stood in the driveway, staring at the rows of cars, the lights glowing warmly through the windows inside, and I felt the weight of everything pressed down at once. I thought about the years I had spent clawing my way through failures and false starts. The nights I stayed up until 3 in the morning, writing code, rewriting business plans, chasing investors who told me no more times than I could count. I thought about the humiliations, the bills stacked high on my desk, the endless worry that I'd made a mistake walking away from the safe path Dad had laid out for me. And I thought about how none of that mattered to them. To my own family, my struggle wasn't resilience. It was proof of weakness. My persistence wasn't strength. It was foolishness. That night, standing in the dark, I let myself feel it fully. The sting, the shame, the bitter taste of betrayal. For the first time in years, I felt like the boy I used to be, fighting a battle he couldn't win at a table where he never belonged. And for a moment, I almost believed them. Maybe I really was the failure they saw. Maybe everything I had built, all the long hours, all the sacrifices, was just a fragile house of cards waiting to collapse. But the moment didn't last. I pulled my coat tighter around me and let the cold burn my lungs until the ache grounded me. Because beneath the pain, something else was stirring. Something sharper. I remember Daniel's smirk, Dad's cruel satisfaction, Clara's mocking eyes, and I realized they weren't just laughing at me. They were underestimating me. Again. And that was their mistake. I left that night without saying goodbye. I didn't even bother with excuses. I just walked back in, grabbed my coat from the hook, and slipped out the door. No one stopped me. No one cared. And that hurt worse than anything they had said. But it also freed me. Driving home through the quiet streets, the city lights blurring through my windshield, I made a decision. I wasn't going to fight them on their terms. I wasn't going to argue or beg for their approval. I was going to let them believe they had won. Let them sit in their smug certainty. Let them laugh. Because when the truth came out, when the foundation they stood on crumbled beneath them, their laughter would be the first thing to die. And for the first time all night, I allowed myself to smile. Not the polite, forced smile I'd worn at the table, but something darker, something patient. This wasn't the end. It was only the silence before the storm. The weeks after Thanksgiving were strangely quiet. My phone didn't buzz with family texts. No one checked in. No one asked how I was doing. At first, the silence stung. It confirmed what I had always known. That to them, I was disposable, a background character in their perfect little narrative. But slowly, that sting dulled and transformed into something else, freedom. Without their constant commentary, their voices no longer echoing in my head, I could finally hear my own clearly. I threw myself back into work. My company, something I had built from the ground up with two close partners, wasn't the flimsy, failing project Daniel had painted it to be. It had struggled in the early years, yes. I'd made mistakes, learned painful lessons, lost sleep and money chasing dead ends. But those scars had sharpened me. We had finally found our rhythm, pivoted into the right sector, and landed clients that actually mattered. Quietly, steadily, the numbers had begun to shift upward. Deals were closing, revenue was climbing, and investors who once brushed me off were suddenly calling me back. It wasn't glamorous. Most days were a blur of long meetings, coding sessions, contract negotiations, and late-night brainstorming with my team. But for the first time, the work felt less like climbing a mountain and more like running downhill with momentum at my back. Every small victory stacked on top of the last until they weren't small anymore. I'd wake up to check the metrics, and they'd be better than the day before. And then the day after that. I didn't tell my family. I didn't post about it online. I kept everything close to my chest, letting them live in the shadow of their assumptions. It gave me a strange satisfaction, knowing that while they laughed about me, my world was quietly shifting. By the spring, the shift wasn't quiet anymore. A major industry player reached out to us, interested in a partnership. One meeting turned into 3, and before long we were in serious talks. The kind of talks that made my partner's eyes widen and their voices drop in disbelief. "Do you realize what this means?" One of them whispered after a conference call. "This could change everything." I realized it, but I kept my cool. I had learned the hard way not to celebrate too soon. But deep down, I knew the tide wasn't just turning. It was about to sweep me forward. Meanwhile, I started changing too. Not just financially, though the growing bank account certainly helped. I carried myself differently. When I walked into meetings, I no longer felt like I was begging for a chance. I was evaluating them. When people spoke, I listened with confidence instead of insecurity. The years of being torn down had oddly prepared me for this. I had already survived every insult, every dismissal. Now, in the real world, I was untouchable. Outside of work, I started building a life that wasn't defined by the ghosts of my family. I moved into a new apartment downtown, spacious and bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city. I filled it with things I chose, not things inherited or handed down. I made new friends, people who respected me for who I was instead of who they thought I should be. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, ground I had built with my own hands. But success has a way of circling back to those who once ignored you. As our company's name started circulating in articles and industry newsletters, I noticed a shift. Old acquaintances began reaching out, congratulating me, asking for coffee, hinting at opportunities. Even some distant relatives sent the occasional message, just vague enough to be polite but curious enough to be opportunistic. And then, one night in early summer, it happened. I was sitting in my office, reviewing numbers that still felt surreal when my phone buzzed. A message from Clara. "Hey, long time no talk. Heard some things about your company. Dad and Daniel were just discussing it the other day. Call me when you can. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening with a mix of amusement and anticipation. For months, I had lived with their betrayal, their laughter ringing in my ears. Now, they were whispering my name, piecing together fragments of a story they never imagined could be true. I didn't reply. Not yet. Because if there was one thing I'd learned, it was patience. Revenge doesn't come from a single outburst. It comes from timing, from letting the cracks widen until the whole structure collapses. And the cracks in their world were already spreading. By the time summer slipped into fall, my world had changed so drastically that I barely recognized the man who had sat silent at that Thanksgiving table less than a year earlier. The company I co-founded was no longer just a startup. We had grown leaner, sharper, and far more valuable than anyone on the outside realized. The deal we had been negotiating all spring was finally signed. A merger with a major player that elevated us from scrappy newcomers to a name that people in the industry couldn't ignore. When the announcement went public, my phone nearly overheated with messages. Reporters, recruiters, old classmates, even people I hadn't spoken to since high school suddenly remembered my number. But the one message that stopped me cold was from Daniel. Congrats on the merger. Dad and I would love to talk sometime. Proud of you, little brother. I almost laughed. The hypocrisy was so thick I could choke on it. Proud. Just months ago, he had sat across the table and dismantled me in front of the family, twisting my past failures into a joke. Now, with a single headline, he wanted to rewrite history. But I didn't reply. Not yet. Because something else was brewing. As part of the merger, I had been pulled into high-level meetings, the kind where every detail mattered. That's when I stumbled across it. In one of the financial reviews, buried in pages of analysis and acquisition strategy, I saw a familiar name. My father's company. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, just a competitor listed in a broader market analysis. But then I dug deeper, and what I found made me sit back in my chair, stunned. The company Dad had built, the empire he lorded over us our entire lives, was faltering. Contracts were shrinking, overhead was ballooning, and the market had shifted beneath him while he refused to adapt. What's worse, Daniel wasn't saving it. He was propping it up with duct tape and arrogance. They were stretched thin, quietly desperate, and whether they realized it or not, circling the drain. And the company that had just merged with mine? They were circling Dad's company like wolves. They were already in discussions about acquisition. In other words, Dad's empire was on the chopping block, and I was now sitting in the room where those decisions would be made. I can't explain the rush that went through me when I realized it. Years of humiliation, of being told I'd never measure up, of watching Daniel smirk while Dad tore me down. All of it crystallized into one truth. I was in the exact position to turn the tables. The irony was almost too much to take in. Dad, who had built his identity on control and dominance, was about to lose everything. And he had no idea that the failure sitting across from him at Thanksgiving was the one holding the match. I played it cool, though. I didn't tell my partners the personal connection, didn't let even a flicker of emotion show in those meetings. I asked questions, nodded thoughtfully, and took notes like the consummate professional. But inside, a storm was raging. Every evening, I'd come home and pace my apartment, replaying that Thanksgiving night in my head. Dad's smirk, Daniel's betrayal, Clara's mocking laugh. I had let them think they'd broken me. I had walked out of that house in silence, letting them believe I was nothing. And now? Now I was in the one position they could never have imagined. It was more than revenge. It was poetic justice. But I didn't rush. Timing mattered. If I stepped in too soon, it would look personal. If I waited, if I let the cracks widen, if I let their arrogance blind them just a little longer, then when the hammer fell, it would shatter everything. The texts from my family kept coming. Clara sent me photos of her new condo, asking casually if I wanted to invest in some side project she was cooking up. Mom left voicemails, her voice sugary sweet, talking about how the family misses you. Daniel invited me to golf. And Dad, of all people, sent a curt message that read, "We should talk. Business." I ignored them all. Instead, I kept gathering information. The more I learned, the clearer it became. Their downfall wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. And when it came, I wouldn't have to lift a finger to destroy them. All I had to do was let the truth surface. But deep down, I knew I wasn't going to stop there. Not after everything they had done. Because if life had taught me anything, it was this. Sometimes you don't just wait for karma. Sometimes you become it. The meeting that changed everything didn't look like much on the surface. A sleek glass conference room, a long table polished to a mirror shine, executives in tailored suits flipping through binders thick with financials. But for me, sitting there in my gray blazer, pen in hand, it felt like the culmination of every humiliation I'd ever endured. Because on the agenda that day was a single item: acquisition strategy for a mid-sized company, my father's company. I remember the way the head of strategy outlined the situation, her voice cool and precise. They're over-leveraged. Too much overhead, declining contracts. We can acquire at a discount. The only question is whether we dismantle or restructure. She flipped the page, revealing charts and graphs that, to everyone else in the room, represented opportunity. To me, it represented years of sneers, smirks, and words I could never forget. You'll never amount to anything. When it came my turn to speak, I kept my voice measured. They're a legacy company, but their model hasn't adapted. If we integrate their client base into our tech infrastructure, we could double efficiency and increase market share within a year. Heads nodded around the table. The motion passed without a hitch. And just like that, the machine was in motion. I didn't rush home to celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I walked out of that building like any other professional ending their day, briefcase in hand, expression neutral. But inside, I felt a steady, controlled burn. Not glee, not gloating, just a quiet certainty that the tables had finally turned. Weeks later, Dad called me. Not Daniel, not Clara, Dad himself. I let it ring twice before I answered. His voice was lower than I remembered, stripped of its usual commanding boom. Henry, we need to talk. I leaned back in my chair, staring out at the city skyline through my office window. About what? There was a pause, a hesitation I had never once heard from him. Business. I understand you're involved with the group reviewing my company. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. That's right. For the first time in my life, my father didn't know what to say. The silence stretched so long that I finally added, "Funny, isn't it? You always told me I'd never amount to anything. And now, here we are." When the deal finalized, the papers signed, it wasn't a public spectacle. There was no dramatic press conference, no shouting match across a dinner table. It was quiet, clinical. My father's company, his pride, his legacy, became ours. Contracts shifted, assets absorbed, employees reassigned. What had once been the source of his authority was now under my oversight. The first time I walked into his office, the one I had never been allowed to enter as a child without knocking, I paused at the doorframe. The nameplate with his initials was still on the desk. The same desk where he'd once told me I was wasting my life. I ran my hand over the wood, smooth and cold, and for a brief moment, I saw my younger self standing there, small and ashamed. Then I sat down in his chair. That night, when I went home, I found my phone flooded with messages from my family. Daniel, desperate. Clara, confused. Mom, pleading for me to be compassionate. And Dad sent a single line. "We should discuss terms." I didn't reply, because this wasn't about terms. This wasn't about saving them or punishing them in some explosive, dramatic way. This was about balance. About taking back the power they had stripped from me my whole life. And now that I held it, I wasn't going to let it go. The revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was in the silence that followed. The silence when my father realized he no longer held the throne. The silence when Daniel understood that no amount of smirking could rewrite reality. The silence when Clara saw that her mocking comments no longer had teeth. For the first time in my life, I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their acceptance. I had taken the one thing they valued most, the empire they built on arrogance and control, and made it mine. And as I sat alone in my apartment, city lights glittering beyond the window, I finally allowed myself a single laugh. Not bitter, not triumphant, just free. Because the boy who would never amount to anything was gone, and the man who replaced him had just rewritten the story. Fallout came faster than I expected. Within weeks of the acquisition, the ripple effects began. Contracts that Dad had clung to for years were reviewed, and several were restructured under my oversight. Departments that had bloated under Daniel's mismanagement were trimmed, leaving him sidelined, stripped of the authority he had once wielded like a crown. Employees who once bowed to him now reported to me, and though they were polite, I could see the shift in their eyes. They no longer saw Daniel as the heir. He was just another manager clinging to a crumbling reputation. Clara tried a different tactic. She called me one evening, her voice sugar-sweet, dripping with practiced charm. "Henry, you've always been so generous. Maybe you could help me out? Just a little? I'm trying to start something new, and I know you'd want your sister to succeed." Her words reminded me of all those years when she stood by while they mocked me, never once raising a hand to defend me. I let her finish her pitch before I answered, my tone steady. "Clara, I think you'll figure it out on your own. After all, you've always been good at surviving on your own terms, right?" She went quiet, and I ended the call before she could reply. Mom sent letters, handwritten, full of regret and half apologies. She wrote about how she wished she'd done more to protect me, how she let Dad's voice drown out her own, how she wanted us to be a family again. I read every word, and though part of me ached, I folded the letters neatly and placed them in a drawer. Because forgiveness doesn't erase the years of silence. It doesn't erase the moments when she chose comfort over courage. And Dad, my father, the man who once controlled every room he entered, was the one who fell the hardest. He called me to his office one last time, the office that was no longer his. He sat across from me, smaller somehow, his voice no longer booming but gravelly and worn. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "That company was my life. I built it with my hands. Every brick, every contract, every late night, it was me." His eyes, once sharp and commanding, searched mine for a shred of sympathy. "You can't take that away." I leaned forward, my hands clasped on the desk that had once been his altar. "I didn't take it away, Dad. You gave it up the moment you stopped listening, the moment you decided you were too proud to change. I just happened to be the one waiting when the house of cards collapsed. For the first time in my life, my father had no answer. No lecture. No cutting remark. Just silence. When he stood to leave, his shoulders hunched, I realized something. This wasn't about me proving him wrong anymore. It was about finally seeing him for what he was. A man who had built walls so high around himself that when they finally fell, he had nothing left. The family dinners ended after that. Thanksgiving came around the following year, but there was no invitation, no forced gathering, no room full of cutting remarks. They scattered, Daniel nursing his wounded pride, Clara chasing her own survival, Mom writing letters to a son she no longer knew how to reach, and Dad retreating into the shadows of a legacy that no longer existed. And me? I didn't need them anymore. That November evening, I sat in my own home, surrounded not by judgment, but by people I had chosen, friends, colleagues, partners who respected me not because of my last name, but because of what I had built. Laughter filled the room, genuine and warm, the kind I had never known at my family's table. As the night drew on, I stepped onto my balcony, the city alive beneath me, and I thought back to that Thanksgiving when Dad laughed in my face. I remembered his words, the sting, the silence that followed. And then I remembered the look on his face when he realized the company that bought his empire, his pride, was mine. I let the cold air fill my lungs, my smile slow and steady. Because in the end, I didn't just prove him wrong. I rewrote the story, and that was the final gift they ever gave me. The fire to rise, and the satisfaction of watching their empire crumble from the very throne they said I'd never reach.